Hi, everyone. Thanks very much for joining. I'm Christoforos Anagnostopoulos. I'm a partner in McKinsey QuantumBlack. QuantumBlack is the branch of McKinsey that helps organizations around the world adopt AI and transform their organizations through the use of AI and advanced analytics, digital technology, and now GenAI. And we've helped build or deploy or test or think through how to adopt the best-in-class technologies at any given point in the journey, all the way from analytics to data science to AI to GenAI in organizations around the world across all practices and domains. And through this journey, we've recognized some common themes, but at the same time, it's important to recognize that a year and a bit ago, when GenAI really launched and had its opening, a lot has changed, and not all organizations are prepared to handle the consequences of what's changed. Today, I wanted to focus a little bit around what we call responsible practices or ethical, safe use of generative AI. And this is not a talk about disaster stories, right? Although there are some of those as well in the news, as I'm sure you know. It's more about how to enable, to empower an organization to experiment rapidly in an agile fashion with proper governance so that you can traverse that big gap from a pilot to an actual deployment. Because what we see in most organizations, and I'll come back to that, is that there's a lot of eagerness and enthusiasm to experiment with this technology, to pilot potentially, but the moment that you go from that stage to a full rollout, a deployment, and a transformation, that's when we see most attrition, most projects fail at that stage. In part, that's because of risks that weren't handled by design to begin with, or because of nervousness from senior leaders that may be comfortable with people in the organization experimenting with GenAI, but suddenly when it comes to launch, they get uncomfortable with the risks that they're facing. So it's very important to have a view as to this framework from early on. Before I start, I just wanted to also mention that QuantumBlack, which is our kind of AI arm, does work also in actual builds and deployments. So some of this talk will be a little bit technical towards the end. But of course, we're also advising organizations on the strategy around how to think about the transformative effect of AI and GenAI for their particular organization. So there's a little bit of both in this presentation. So let me start by just reminding us of some high-profile cases of risks that may have gotten different degrees of publicity depending on the domain or the industry you're in. It's very well understood now that you can have very difficult problems with bias. That's not new. We've always been worried about fairness in AI and ML. Any system that's trained on historical data will, to some extent, reproduce biases that are in that data. And knowing how to proactively defend against that is not obvious. How do you not overshoot? What is the criterion of fairness that you're using? There are many, and they're often competing. So you can satisfy one definition of fairness while violating another. So that's not new, but it is very kind of visually shocking when it happens with generative AI. And it can be much more offensive and triggers reactions from consumers and users that are understandably very strong. So there's also issues around IP infringement. The appetite of these models for data is very different to what classical AI or data science models require. And as a result, this necessarily means that most models are trained on vast data sets, and it's very difficult to ensure that there's proper licensing and IP in place for all of those data sets that are being used. So that's another big theme. And we've seen various sort of backlash stories around the use of data, perhaps without permission or without explicit or appropriate permission. And of course, there's the question of kind of misinformation and accuracy, and what does that even mean in the generative AI space? Generative AI models are not trained to be accurate in the sense of ground truth. They're trained to resemble the text that they've been trained on. So their core objective is kind of misaligned with some of the uses that we see these models being used in. So for example, we know now that GPT systems can fool scientists, they can fool peer review. The question, you think about productivity uplift when you're using GenAI, and it's a genuine question: is it easier to write a document from scratch or to check the accuracy of claims made by a document by a GPT system or something similar? And in certain situations, the answer will go one way. In other situations, it may go the other. So there's that added burden of identifying the accuracy of this content. And finally, there's issues that we'll come back to around kind of how do you integrate these systems to your organization. This is now, whereas with data science and AI, classical AI, if you like, we could deploy everything in-house in a large organization. Now, increasingly, the ecosystem is shaped in a way that you have to carry some amount of third-party risk, and we'll come back to the consequences of that. Now, I want to try and be kind of helpful to the conversation, and this is a great event. I'm very, very glad to be here and honored, and you've heard from many, great organizations already. I wanted to give you kind of a summary of what we hear from C-level leaders around the industry when they use these tools. And before I go into the numbers, I want to make sure to explain why these are important, right? Whether you work in a large organization or whether you are building software that you want to sell to a large organization by a startup or some other organization, it's very important to understand that pilots are easy, but transformations are hard. And in the end, the C-level view of the risks and the benefits of a technology are what determines, to a large extent, the ability to move fast in that journey. So that's why it matters to see what the perspective is from the C-suite. And this is based on a survey of executives from all of our clients around the world. So here are some numbers that matter. 57% of CXOs reported that generative AI is a key priority for them. 49% of non-tech CXOs reported the same thing. So the takeaway is that the enthusiasm cuts across the board, and this is new, right? This was not the case in prior, let's say, publicity events for AI. It was still mostly under the delta between tech leaders and non-tech leaders was very high in previous waves. But now, because GPT is used by, frankly, their children and their grandchildren, right? Like it's all over the place. So therefore, the enthusiasm cuts across the tech and the non-tech sector. At the same time, 86% of CXOs reported no or limited responsible AI programs, right? So no or limited governance that's specifically tailored to mitigate AI risk. And only 9% of CXOs felt very prepared to implement generative AI. In fact, when you look at the cross-tabulation, out of those leaders that said generative AI is a key priority for them, only 16% said that they feel very prepared to implement it. And that is the whole story. I mean, that one slide is the whole story and why it's so important to embrace a risk mindset from the beginning by design rather than let it kind of slide, get all the enthusiasm behind the pilot, and then, of course, fail to press the go button when the pilot finishes, even if it is successful. Now, when it comes to actually cracking open that box of risk, risk is a scary word. It is associated in the tech sector with kind of a reluctance to move, like it's like a counter incentive, whereas we kind of feel strongly that this is exactly the opposite, right? Like when you are aware and cognizant of the risks and you have a thoughtful approach towards mitigating them, that actually accelerates rather than decelerates adoption. So let's open that box and see what's in there. So right now, 69% of CXOs believe that inaccuracy is a top risk for AI systems. And about 36% malicious content generation, so kind of actively, consciously producing inaccurate results with a malicious intent. At the same time, 97% of CXOs fear exploitation of AI systems, right, like vulnerabilities. And 92% think that GenAI exacerbates that risk. So the distinction between the left and the right is how leaders think of AI risk versus GenAI risk. So what's different? So we see that there's an increase in the worry about malicious use and inaccuracy. There's a very clear, that's the biggest delta that we see across all risk categories in these two spaces. And we'll come back to what that means in terms of mitigating those risks. What makes the picture even more challenging is that the regulation landscape is viewed very differently, and it's rapidly evolving, right? By geography, even a year ago, things were very different to what they are today. So only 40% of up to 40% of CXOs feel somewhat or very concerned about complying with upcoming AI regulations. A similar number holds of experts. But when you look at the new regulations that are coming up in the next 5 years, up to 66% of CXOs believe that information security measures for foundation models will be implemented. So there's uncertainty about how to apply rules right now, and there's even more uncertainty about what's coming. And that's creating further nervousness in terms of deploying these systems for real to consumers, either in a B2C fashion or within the organizations. So putting those views aside for a second, maybe let's try to think about what is the right framework to try and start kind of navigating through this terrain in a safe way. So essentially, you're talking about policies and best practices, and you want to think about various dimensions. Different organizations break down the landscape in different ways, but inevitably they all anchor around similar dimensions. One way to describe this is, first of all, AI has to be human-centric. So you have to think about the user, take a very human-centric perspective, understanding how the user will use the tool rather than think of the AI in a tech-forward fashion and kind of push it to the user. Fairness and trustworthiness and inclusiveness are key values that need to be kind of thought about by design when you start working on the project rather than as an afterthought. Transparency and explainability is a huge challenge. It was already difficult with AI. Now it's become even more difficult with GenAI. But you still need to engage with it. Just because it's difficult doesn't mean it goes away. So what does explainable mean? What does the user expect when they ask for an explanation? So you may have heard, for example, of the right to an explanation. If you're using an AI system in some way that really impacts your life, like getting a credit score or a loan, you're entitled by law in Europe to an explanation of why your card application was rejected, right? What does that mean, right? So there's many ways technically to actually translate that to an actual technology. So for example, had I had a different gender, would my credit application have gone through? That's a legitimate question that you could ask to an AI system. So when you're designing the AI system, you need to think about that. You need to think about what the user might feel if they're hurt or they think they have been hurt or harmed by the system, and what explanation could you offer as to the reasons? These are not easy questions, but they're not non-starters either. There are tools that we can use to make progress, right? So it's important to think about that. And then, of course, data protection, privacy, and security is a constant concern. It evolves and changes a little bit with GenAI, but at least in that category, there were already things in place in most organizations. And finally, ongoing monitoring and evaluation is something that we're still thinking about. In classical AI systems, especially in supervised learning, you had some metric of performance, like what is the mean error between your predicted probability of defaulting on a loan versus the actual percentage of people that were given a loan and then they defaulted, right? So you could track that over time. It's harder to know how to track the right KPI in generative AI systems. Of course, user satisfaction is the proxy we all use, but that's not a values-driven proxy necessarily. What the user may think is satisfactory to them in the moment may actually be not so beneficial for them longer term, and therefore it's harder to measure exactly what performance means in that context. So that's something to think about too. So we've tried to codify, looking across organizations and regulatory bodies and the academic literature, what are the main risk categories when it comes to generative AI? And here's one attempt at that. You could focus on the following 8. Impaired fairness, IP infringement, privacy concerns. The difference between the second and third is that IP infringement is about either you training your model on data that you don't really have the license to use in that way, or conversely, your model is being used by others in ways that leak your IP. So that's also a possibility. It's not very straightforward to control how much information is leaked from the training data in a generative AI system, whereas it's very easy to control that if you're using a classical AI system. Privacy concerns, malicious use, we've talked about this quite a bit, and security threats, of course. And we've only scratched the surface of these 2 categories, and I think we're going to see more. Performance and explainability, third-party risk is what I mentioned in the end. And interestingly, for the first time, we're also encountering an ESG impact, not only because of kind of just general social consequences of using AI systems, but actually the carbon footprint of the systems is incredible. So we've just started, right? Like 1 year in, and still already we see that some of the ways in which we use foundation models right now are not sustainable. There's academic groups working on kind of lower carbon footprint training systems, so that's something that I think will be a core trend in the future. Now, I'm not going to go into full detail, but I just wanted to flag a couple of examples of what happens when you double-click further into these types of categories. So, for example, in impaired fairness, it's not just a question of creating kind of bias stereotype answers, which is in itself tricky to deal with, but there's variations of that are quite new. For example, misrepresentation risk, novel misrepresentation risk is the situation where the generative AI produces content that's not kind of clearly identified as being produced by a machine. So you might think that you're talking to a human, whereas you're not, and that can create a lot of downstream issues when it comes to fairness and accountability as well, right? Like, because going back to my earlier point, it's very important that your downstream user, your end user, is able to have a path to kind of complain or understand why they were harmed by one of the AI systems that your organization is partially responsible for. Maybe jumping to the next page, we could also talk a little bit about performance and explainability risk. So it's quite interesting. There was a lot of discussion maybe 2-3 years ago around ethical frameworks for understanding AI risk. And there's a very famous philosopher of technology, Luciano Floridi, who wrote this paper where he was trying to articulate, like, does AI really pose any new ethical questions? Or is it just like any other technology? It depends on how you use it, right? And as he was trying to think through this question, the insight that he came to was that, in fact, there is one type of ethical concern which is new in the sense that no other technology has posed it to such extent, and that's explainability. With every other technology, there's the potential to use it for good or for bad, to harm unwillingly or willingly. There's obviously questions of autonomy. These questions exist in AI. Are you reducing human autonomy by taking on decision-making? But the same questions arise in medicine, in biotech. So in that sense, yes, these are important ethical concerns, but they are not net new. Whereas explainability is quite new. We've never had before to interact with systems that we don't understand how they actually reach the decisions that they do. And in any other setting where we would face such a system that appears to be unpredictable, we would be extremely nervous, right? Like, a lot of our safety philosophy around products is anchored on predictability and explainability. The way that we decide a product is safe is because we know the parameters within which its performance is in any given input, right? Like, we understand its input-output behavior fully. This holds for an airplane, it holds for a children's toy, it holds for a piece of beverage, right, that you consume. So that explainable and predictable behavior is core to our technology and infrastructure as a society versus safety. And that doesn't apply to these AI systems because, sure, we understand in theory how they're built, but we don't really know, we cannot anticipate what the output will be in any given situation. And therefore, we need to have a different perspective completely when it comes to explainability and safety in that sense. So transparency is related, of course, to explainability, and explainability is more like a user-focused aspect of the problem. Like, does the user understand why the output is the way it is? Whereas transparency is more like, for example, that can a regulator audit, right? The sequence of steps that led to a harmful behavior by an AI system. Is it available to a technology-savvy person rather than the end user? So different aspects of the same problem. If we move towards kind of ESG impact and third-party risk, I'm not going to mention too much about ESG impact other than to say that it's not just the carbon footprint, but of course, talent disruption is a core theme that will trouble many organizations. You know, following the enthusiasm of, oh, we can become 10x more productive, obviously the next step is, does that mean we now need to have 1/10 the workforce? And the answer, hopefully, is not yes in most situations, but the question does arise, and it is a very difficult question to ask. Similarly, adverse social impact, I mean, that's not net new, right? Like, for example, our society's encounters with social media is a great example of what not to do with GenAI, right? Like, so when social media were rolled out, no one really anticipated that we could lead to kind of polarization and attention economy situations, obsessive use, and so on. And GenAI, in principle, allows you to have much more intimate relationships with AI systems, allows for much more personalization, and therefore, especially demographics or communities that are more vulnerable to such type of use and abuse of content are at great risk. There's no question about that. So that's something important to keep in mind as the systems become more commonplace. Going back a little bit to the numbers that we saw in the beginning, if we look at current attitudes towards responsible and generative AI, we saw some of these high-level numbers, but it's interesting to look at the difference between leaders and experts. So, for instance, when it comes to absence or limited availability of responsible AI programs, leaders of organizations are much more concerned about that than experts. And this is kind of a function of the fact that experts can see a way through this risk, but that's not obvious to leaders, right? Like, that's an important aspect of what these transformations require. It's very important that there's an upstream education of what this technology is like and how it can be safely used from experts and from the technical talent in an organization all the way up to the senior leadership. Now, when you look at the top risks, maybe I'll jump to the next page, actually, which is quite interesting. Most of the risk mitigations that are currently implemented are focusing on privacy and data protection. So 84% of organizations believe privacy to be the prioritized principle. And 86 are implementing sensitive data protection controls. But in fact, more than half also plan to implement prompt enrichment and human verification of AI responses in the next year. So we do see organizations doubling down on what they know how to do, which is privacy and security, because they have business functions that know how to do that, but also immediately taking action to protect in new ways against generative AI risks. So it's a turning point in how security organizations and security functions within organizations are thinking about AI and technology. Now, we need to take a step back and realize, though, that not all of these risks are equally important in all use cases, right? So some use cases will pose a spike in one particular risk category and actually be fairly safe in all others. Some use cases will be kind of risky across the board. So we're just listing some examples here, and none of these are going to be true in all organizations. I'm just illustrating the point. But if you think about customer journey, for instance, e.g., chatbots for customer service, probably the most popular use case right now, there's a relatively high risk for impaired fairness and privacy violations, interpretability, and generally social impact, but a lower risk for IP infringement or malicious use. Whereas when you think about coding, which is a use case that we've delivered many times already for clients, kind of thinking of using GenAI either as a co-pilot when you're coding for your programmers or switching from one legacy system to a new one, legacy language to a new one. Well, their security is the primary risk, right? Because you can very easily, if you over-rely on these tools, introduce security threats in your software. So one has to take a very bespoke approach to assessing the risk profile of any given use of this technology. It's not one size fits all by any means. This could look a bit like this. So if you are in a banking example, for instance, you can think of the different categories of risk and kind of produce a heat map that is specific to your industry as to how much risk you think you're exposed to along each of these dimensions. And this may seem like a tedious exercise, but it's exactly this ability to break risk down into specific things that allows organizations to then act on that and move on. Because otherwise, if there's just a generic fear about the technology, that just leads to inaction and poor adoption. So it's very important to identify these hotspots of risk, and they're not going to be across the board for all use cases. It will depend on the type of use case you're dealing with. So given that there is, to some extent, this novel risk profile, given that there's nervousness, given that there's regulatory shifting landscapes, how can organizations approach adoption of AI at scale and generative AI at scale right now? So we see that there's 3 steps to that. The first one is to have a set of principles and guardrails, right? Like, so you need to be explicit about what your approach towards generative AI will be. And for different organizations, this will be different, but in general, it's going to anchor on some variation of the framework that I've described so far. So that's your step 1, and that has to come from the leadership of the organization. If you're a startup trying to serve large organizations, you need to think about how you relate to that framework. Many large organizations have been very outspoken about their perception of AI risk and governance, and even tech companies have almost self-regulated or attempted to self-regulate by producing long documents of like their ethical approach towards AI and the guardrails, and these are very useful when you think about third-party risk. If you're an organization and you want to procure a software system for a specific cause, you want to know what your counterparty's kind of approach towards risk is and that it's consistent with your own. So it's important for everybody to take a step back and be explicit about their AI, responsible AI framework. Then once that's in place, and you have your axis and your framework and your types of risk and risk appetite for all of them, the next step is to take your use cases and prioritize them. And that's, of course, a very common exercise in any new technology. Clearly, if you're a very large retail bank or a pharmaceutical company or a retail company, there's many different ways in which you could adopt AI and GenAI, right? Like, and there's a little bit of kind of, right now, a little bit of a panicky move to pilot GenAI everywhere. That doesn't necessarily always work. It's very important to prioritize the use cases that have the most impact, and also that have a risk profile that will allow you to actually launch the solution once it's been piloted successfully. So the use case prioritization exercise is important, and you have to kind of trade off these things: business value, feasibility, or implementation complexity and risk severity. And then one thing to note is that the question is, who does that, right? Like, who sets the principles? Who does the use case prioritization? And the answer is not the CEO, right? Like, of course, the CEO has to have a proactive attitude towards these topics, but the governance framework that works must necessarily involve the technical people that build this technology, right? Like, it cannot be the case that these are imposed top-down by either risk executives or business executives. It has to be a broader governance framework that goes all the way to the tech organization, the tech part of the organization, and engineers that know how to mitigate these risks. And they actually, it's very important for them to feel the safety to raise issues as they see them, right? Because right now, the fact that we're not talking about this enough means that as a data scientist in a large organization, if you see an issue with one of the algorithms that you helped develop, and you're testing it and you realize, oh, this is producing biased content, it's scary, right? Like, it's not easy to speak up at that point and say, hey, sorry, I think our model is racist. That's not very easy to do. So there needs to be a change of culture from everything is safe until we're told otherwise, to actually, these technologies are so new that they're likely not safe, not fully safe. And that's okay if we're careful about it and we mitigate risks, but that also creates the emotional safety for engineers to speak up and raise risks and have an open conversation about them. And that's the risk management piece, right? Like, I know risk management may sound a little bit boring to a tech audience. Like, I used to be in the tech sector, I understand, but this is not a theoretical exercise. It's about empowering the actual people working on these technologies to have the tools they need and the roles they need to do quality control on their products, and to speak up and be heard about the risks of these technologies. So we've talked about this quite a bit, so I'm just going to skip to the second pillar of the 3 that I just introduced, and thinking about how organizations could prioritize use cases. So the first thing to note is that depending on the industry you're in, you have a completely different exposure to risk. Obviously, financial services have had a long history of being regulated when it comes to the use of model-based outputs. So they have an apparatus they can use for this. But even legal organizations now start to use GenAI. In our white paper that we published a few months ago around kind of the different sectors that will be impacted by GenAI and the total impact, economic impact, law was one of the biggest domains, right? And of course, legal documents have to be tremendously precise, but at the same time, clearly there's a lot of repetition, a lot of patterned thinking in those documents that can be a very good use case for generative AI. So how do you manage that level of accuracy that is required there? In the life sciences, where I do personally all of my work, I serve biotech and pharmaceutical companies in the context of adoption of AI and generative AI. You have very different problems depending when you're working in early research. So if you're using foundation models to understand biology, just like large language models understand language, we're seeing tremendous progress in large language-like models understanding different aspects of biology. Now, in early research, a lot of what you do is ideation and scientific hypothesis generation. So there you can have a lower risk profile of embracing generative AI or foundation models as part of that journey. But as you move towards drug development, of course, there it's a highly regulated space. Clinical trials have to operate a certain way. And there it becomes much more challenging to think about how to incorporate generative AI in that process. Challenging, but not impossible. And in fact, as you may have come across kind of discussions of what could be the most disruptive use case for generative AI in healthcare, and patient engagement is one of the top use cases, right? Like the need for patients to have more time with their doctors for them to explain their condition and their treatment options. This can be facilitated by GenAI tools, either by automatic note-taking or indeed by outsourcing part of that conversation that can be safely outsourced to a generative AI system. And similarly for retail or other organizations, you'll have different risk profiles, and each industry is now trying to understand what does safe mean for me. And it's important that organizations also speak to each other to form safety protocols and kind of mutually agree, yeah, this is what we mean by safe in this situation. Now, if we talk a little bit more technically and we think about engineering teams, right, like it's very important to approach the design of AI systems with a risk mindset and introduce risk questions in all of the different stages of design. So first of all, be clear about what the model will actually be used for. I know it sounds obvious, but very often you can have models that are multi-purpose, and there's a temptation to use the same kind of backend for different types of use cases, but that's not necessarily the right answer, because different ways of using the model will entail different risks. Similarly, in the technical design, you need to think very clearly about which modes of data you'll use, and that affects your ability to use different types of foundation models or LLMs. Some of them are multimodal, others can be multimodal in certain ways, but not in other ways. This is such a rapidly evolving space, by the way, that organizations struggle to know how dependent they can be to a third party. So that's a very difficult space to navigate. And similarly for the user experience and the user design, it's very important to distinguish between how the model is used and how the user consumes the output of the model. So details can make a big difference there. So it's quite critical to have a design philosophy when it comes to using AI systems and thinking about the user and what could be harmful or beneficial to them in their use of the product. And this allows you to think about risk in this holistic fashion. Some risk will be tied to the user design, to the user interface design. Other types of risk might be more back-end issues. So across all of these domains, you can think about the risk aspects. Now, when we think about integrating risk management in the development and design of systems, it's important to also understand that this is not obvious. What role is that, right? Do you have like a compliance officer joining agile sprints? How does that work, right? So you need to be explicit about it, and there's no single answer. But generally speaking, there's going to be a few functions that need to be in the loop. Program management, obviously, business, product engineering, information security, legal and compliance, and risk. And what we see in most organizations is that there's going to be a need, at least for the foreseeable future, to form working groups that are cross-functional, so that all of these individuals can have a united perspective on how to approach, what level of risk is appropriate in each situation. Because otherwise what tends to happen is you have a random handover from one function to the other, and it never converges. So you do need a coordinated approach right now. Now, it's also important to note that as GenAI tools are developing for content generation, equally dynamically, we have an ecosystem of bias mitigation tooling, safety tooling. There's a lot of research in that space, thankfully. And that's true also for classical AI systems. So the answer to mitigating bias is not always just have a human check the output, because that, of course, would negate the purpose of many of these deployments, right? It would slow them down to an extent that they become unusable. There's a lot of tooling that you can use. This is an example of Hugging Face Evaluate tool for bias detection. Now, of course, it's a little bit of an arms race between like the two models. Well, one model is trying to effectively create more and more content that makes it to the finish line, and therefore implicitly is evading all of the rules that you may put in there. But that said, if you are working in an environment where there is no malicious intent, it's very possible and effective right now to use tools like this to filter out responses that may rely on stereotyping or hurtful language and so on. So that's one example of kind of building those guardrails around the output of GenAI systems, and there's a plethora of tools to use. Hugging Face is just one example here. Similarly, there's parameter tuning that you can do to the actual models, and this is a very simple example. We can get very technical on this topic, but you can control the degree to which the LLM is kind of creative and goes beyond its training set, if you like. And in certain situations, you want to be very conservative. You'd rather not get an answer than get the wrong answer. In other situations, if you're using it for creative professions, for example, there's no need to be as accurate, and therefore you have to tune that model in a different way. We also will see, inevitably, the ecosystem kind of diversifying into solutions that are specific to different industries. Right now, because we only have 2 or 3 major players, they're trying to cater to everyone, but already, for example, in the life sciences, we have a lot of tools that are LLM-specific for biology, LLM-specific for health economics, right? So that will actually unlock a lot more value in the next 2 to 3 years as the systems become specialized to the domain that they're serving, and therefore also safer to use for those use cases. So to summarize, it's quite important to be comprehensive about the tooling that you can use and to empower your technical teams through continued education and training to know about these tools. Because what's happening right now is a lot of AI teams or data science teams are being repurposed as GenAI teams. And that's not necessarily the right answer. GenAI is much more software engineering heavy. It's a lot of APIs and third-party kind of calls, which is not necessarily the risk of your average data scientist. It depends on the industry. Similarly, many data scientists aren't used to using even more third-party systems to check their existing third-party systems, right? Like just technically that becomes quite complex. You have to take the output of one thing, pass it through another system, then bring it back, refine. So the overall system becomes quite complicated from a software engineering perspective. So it's very important to invest in education, continued education, because this is moving very rapidly, of your technical staff in bias mitigation tools, safety tools, and so on. So this is one example of what a system like that could look like. Rather than just ask the LLM model, you might want to take a few more steps of mitigation, like first search through a knowledge base, an actual classic knowledge base, either a knowledge graph that you maintain internally or just a search engine, cross-correlate the outputs of the two systems, perhaps even constrain the LLM to only query documents in your organization that the specific user is entitled to having access to. So there's a lot of extra systems there that need to be involved in producing an answer. Once you get the output, then you still need to kind of rank it according to a GenAI ranking and go back to the prompt and kind of post-process it, maybe revise it until you get a safe response. This is just one archetype of a solution, but in any given situation, in our experience, systems that make it to production are very rarely a single API call to one of these large language models, but rather look a little bit more like this, with a number of guardrails around them to ensure safe consumption. So before I conclude, it's worth making a note on the regulatory landscape, and I should mention that this is not by any means legal advice, but it's just a fact that there's a lot of regulations that are coming into play in different geographies. And in fact, the regulatory landscape is necessarily kind of working with latency. So we just had the AI Act kind of finally kind of gone through in the EU, and it's already not very adapted to GenAI, right? So that has to now be evolving to something that covers the generative AI risks. And similarly, in other geographies, there's more emphasis on some values and less emphasis on others. So in the EU, of course, privacy is paramount. We have the right to be forgotten, which is a very kind of difficult thing to implement in this situation where your data are potentially used to train an LLM. How can you remove that data from training sets, right? Like there's not even a path towards that. And it's quite different in other geographies. So this matters because the regulatory landscape is, in the end, what will determine how organizations, the red lines in organizations' risk management, right? Like what definitely has to be the case. The one trend that we can kind of reliably predict is that there's a push towards organizations taking on the risk of GenAI systems and with real consequences if harmful behavior is produced. And by taking on, I mean that the developer of the LLMs is perhaps less liable than the organization that takes that LLM and puts it in the hand of the consumer, right? So, and that goes back to my initial point of how do you actually enable the cultural change that you need in order to adopt AI and not kind of pause at the fear of a shifting regulatory landscape. I'll just end with this page, which is kind of a way to think about the different stages in an AI transformation. I mean, to a large extent, most organizations have started to experiment with the technology, right? So we're past that stage. In previous waves of AI, that was even a problem because it wasn't as popular. It wasn't in the press every day. But now we're past the start stage, and we're mostly at the pilot stage. Almost everybody is piloting AI and GenAI systems. But the attrition from piloting to scale, so the ability to actually take a small pilot and scale it to multiple business functions or multiple users, and even much more from scaling to transforming your organization, that step still has tremendous attrition. So a very small percentage of pilots actually make it into production. And in part, the reason for that is uncertainty about risk, right? So the best thing to do is to embrace the fact that we don't know how to make this perfectly safe yet, right? Like own up to that fact as an ecosystem and consciously put in place different frameworks and mitigation plans to move forward. So thank you for your attention and really appreciate being here. Happy to, we have a couple of minutes, happy to take a question or two if there are any.
Thank you. First of all, that was a great talk. So my question is, as a consultancy, when a company or a client reaches out to you for a GenAI application or to build something with GenAI, that's most common nowadays, there is always going to be a better version of it coming up. Suppose if you build an application and there comes a copilot which replaces the built application. So what do you suggest to these clients who are ready to embrace it, but also are afraid that there is going to be a better application and they don't want to spend their money building something that is going to be replaced? So what is your take on it?
Yeah, that's a very, very common problem indeed. In general, there's a question of timing. Do we start now or do we wait until this technology is better? And there's also the question of do we buy or do we build it, right? And I think in general, we believe that speed is a strategy in this space, right? So you have to move fast and accept the fact that a percentage of the resources that you invest in this will be, in retrospect, poorly invested, right? Like because, oh, if only you had waited for 2 months, you would have had the answer. But the evolution of these technologies, there's a lot of papers that describe these scaling laws as the computation that we put into these models, their performance grows. But when you look at it pragmatically, it's not as clear that we are continuing to experience linear progress in every application. So you may experience a gap. Let's say for 6 or 8 months, really there's no huge development. And if you don't move during that time, others will. So it's one of these situations where we believe that as a simplifying heuristic, you should move fast rather than wait. That said, designing systems in a modular fashion so that you don't introduce unnecessary dependencies is extremely critical. So it should be easy to switch from one LLM to another. That should be a design consideration. That wasn't the case 15 years ago. You could say, we're going to do Java. Okay, there was no chance that suddenly Java would be out of date, right? Like, it would happen gradually. You would have time to adapt. It's not a perfect analogy, of course, because it's harder to switch languages than to switch APIs. But that depends on how you build these systems. You have to build them in a way that is easy to switch. So that's kind of the answer that we give. I hope I answered your question.
Thank you. Amazing talk. So assuming you're a startup and you're building, let's say, an SDK or API using OpenAI explicitly, all these responsibilities are transferred to the OpenAI, or you have to fine-tune the model, you have to tell it how the assistant will act, hyperparameters configuration. I know you can do all that, but is it really your responsibility or not?
Yeah, that's a fantastic question. So, look, there's going to be a legal answer to your question that I don't know, right? I'm not a lawyer. But I think if you think about it from a corporate responsibility perspective and from a technology perspective, I think the designer of the system that touches the user has the responsibility, right? Now, it could be possible to transfer that with an appropriate use of licensing and data user agreements and design. But in the end, it's still your responsibility to transfer that, right? So the moment that you have your brand on a system that is used by people, you have the responsibility. Now, at the same time, by you, what do we mean, right? Like, obviously, the leadership of the company, but we need to propagate that responsibility all the way down to the engineers. If we think about how, for instance, statisticians, to take an example of a profession that had a lot of impact maybe 50 years ago, they had to think very carefully about their code of conduct as a community, right? And kind of self-regulate a little bit as a community of scientists and engineers. Similarly, I think data scientists that are now in industry positions were educated during a time where data science were kind of like a gimmick, still a toy, still exploratory, and therefore they didn't have the safety culture that, say, a mechanical engineer has, right? Like, when you're trained as a mechanical engineer, you're trained into a safety culture. Whereas when you were trained as a data scientist in the 90s, it was just like, oh, this is cool, right? Like, no real consequences in the real world. It's just cool. So I think we've already seen a change in education, but the people that are already past the educational system and they're now in organizations, I believe that they do need to think of themselves as the last line of defense. In the end, the engineer is the person that sees the details of the harm that could come upon the user. So that's from my perspective. In the legal side of things, I can't comment, I'm afraid. But yeah, it's going to be definitely interesting to see what solutions lawyers come up with for this. I'm conscious we're out of time. Is there time for one more question? The organizers know best. Sure, why not? Yeah? Okay, one last question.
Thank you. Regarding your last diagram, where is Greece located? Greek companies, in which states are they?
Sorry? Well, Greece as a...
Yes, regarding your last diagram.
Yeah. So I think what we see in Greece is that there's a lot of eagerness to pilot. I'm going to venture to say that, in fact, there's a lot more pragmatism in Greek organizations than we see abroad. Now, you can call that skepticism or conservatism, but it's also, in many cases, just pragmatic. They have a very tight connection to their users because of a smaller market. They want to make sure they get it right the first time rather than just experiment and take bigger risk. So in terms of their eagerness to pilot, we see them being kind of moving at speed with other similar geographies. I mean, obviously, we're not going to compare Greece to the Silicon Valley. But in similar domains, similar geographies, we see them moving at speed. When it comes to the risk framework, I would say that we see a little bit more maturity in Greek organizations than perhaps elsewhere. And that, again, comes from just being pragmatic about, they don't have a lot of room for error, right? Like in comparison to other geographies. Super. Thank you again for your attention.